There were two brothers, called Sigtryg, travel quick, and Halvard, travel hard, who came from Vik and were among King Harald's men. Their mother's family came from Vestfold, and they were related to the king. Their father had relatives on both sides of the river Gotha. He had been a wealthy farmer in Hissing, and they had inherited from him. In all there were four brothers, and the younger two, Thord and Thorgir, stayed at home and looked after the farm. Sigtryg and Halvard handled all the ship's missions, both in Norway and outside it, and had made many dangerous voyages, both to execute people and confiscate property from people whose homes the king had ordered to be attacked. They took a large band of men with them everywhere and were not popular among the common people, but the king respected them highly. They were outstanding runners and skiers, capable of outsailing other men, and strong and shrewd in most respects. They were with the king when all this happened. In the autumn he went to some feasts in Hordaland. One day he had the brothers Halvard and Sigtryg called in, and when they came he told them to take their band of men and spy on the ship that Thorgir's boomer was sailing. He took the ship over to England in the summer. Bring it and everything on board to me except the crew. Let them go in peace if they do not try to defend their ship. The brothers readily agreed, and took a long ship each. They went to look for Thorgils and his men. They heard that he had returned from England and had sailed northwards along the coast. The brothers set off north in the pursuit of Thorgils and his men, and came across them in Fuda Sound. Recognizing the ship, they attacked its seaward side, while some of their men went ashore and boarded it from the gangways. Thorgils and his men were not expecting trouble and had not mounted a guard. Before they knew it, they were fully armed men all over their ship, and they were all captured there and taken ashore, where they were left with no weapons and only the clothes they were wearing. Halvard and his men threw the gangways off the ship, undid the moorings, and towed it out to sea, then veered south until they reached the king. They presented him with the ship and everything on it. When the cargo was unloaded, the king saw that it was very valuable, and that Harik had not been lying. Thorgils and his companions found transport for themselves and went to seek Veldolf and Grim, whom they told of their ordeal. They were given a warm welcome all the same. Gveldolf said everything was turning out as he had predicted. Thorolf would not enjoy the good fortune of the king's friendship indefinitely. And I would not bother much about the loss that Thorolf has just sustained, if there were not more to follow, he said. I suspect once again that Thorolf will fail to realize his limitations in the face of overwhelming force he has to deal with. He asked Thorgils to tell Thorolf that my only advice is to leave the country, because he may be able to do better for himself serving the King of England or Denmark or Sweden. Then he gave Thorgils a fully rigged boat, and tents, and provisions, and everything they needed for their journey. They set off without stopping until they reached Thorolf in the north and told him what had happened. Thorolf took his loss well, saying that he would not go short of money. It's good to have a king to share your money with. Then Thorolf brought some meal and malt and other provisions he needed to keep his men, and said his farmhands would not be dressed as smartly as he had planned for a while. Thorolf sold some of his lands and mortgaged others, but maintained the same style of living as before. He had no fewer men with him than previous winters, rather more in fact, and he was more extravagant in feasts and invitations to his friends. He spent all the winter at home. When spring arrived and the snow and ice melted, Thorolf had a great long ship that he owned brought out, and had it prepared to sail and manned with more than 100 of his men in all, an impressive and well-armed band. When the wind was favorable, Thorolf sailed the ship south, hugging the shore. Then when he reached Birda, they headed out to sea beyond all the islands, sometimes so far that they could only see the top half of the mountains. They continued south and did not hear any news of anybody until they arrived in Vik. There they were told that the king was in Vik and would be going to Uppland in the summer. No one on land knew of Thorolf's whereabouts. With a favorable wind in his sails, he headed for Denmark, from there into the Baltic, where he plundered during the summer without gaining much booty. In the autumn he headed back to Denmark, around the time that the big Norwegian fleet pulled out from Ur, after being stationed there as usual during the summer. Thorolf let them all sail past without being noticed, then sailed to Mostersund one evening. A large Nor had called there on its way from Ur, skippered by Thorolf Thrumme, one of King Harald's agents. He was in charge of the king's land at Thrumme, a large estate where the king spent much time when he was in Vik. Since a lot of provisions were needed for that estate, Thorolf had gone to Ur to buy cargo, malt, flour, and honey, and spent a great amount of the king's money on it. Thorolf and his men attacked the ship and gave Thorolf's crew the option of defending it, but lacking the manpower to keep such a large force at bay, Thorolf surrendered. Thorolf seized the ship and all its cargo and put Thorolf ashore, then sailed both ships north along the coast. On reaching the river Goda, they anchored and waited for nightfall. When it was dark, they rowed the long ship up the river and attacked the farm which Halvard and Sigtryg owned there. They arrived before daybreak, surrounded the farmhouse, and shouted a war cry. The people inside woke up and snatched up their weapons. Thorgir fled out of the sleeping quarters, ran to the wooden fence surrounding the farm, grabbed one of his posts, and vaulted over it. Thorgir's boomer, standing nearby, swung his sword at Thorgir and chopped off the hand that was holding onto the post. Thorgir ran off into the woods while his brother Thord was killed and more than 20 men with him. Afterwards, the raiders took all the valuables and burned the farmhouse. They went back down the river to the sea, where they sailed on the Vik with a favourable wind. Once again they encountered a large ship owned by people from Vik, loaded with malt and meal. Thorolf and his band attacked the ship and the crew surrendered, feeling that they had no chance of warding off the assault. They went ashore with nothing while Thorolf and his men took the ship and its cargo and continued on their way. So, Thorolf had 3 ships when he sailed into Fold from the east. He and his men followed the main sailing route to Lindesnes, travelling as quickly as possible, but coming ashore at the headlands to plunder where they could. On the route north from Lindesnes, they kept farther out to sea, but plundered when they went to shore. North of Fjordane, Thorolf headed for land and went to see his father Kveldov, who welcomed him. Thorolf told his father what happened on his travels in the summer. He spent a short time there, and his father and brother accompanied him back to the ship. Before they parted, Thorolf and his father spoke together. Kveldov said, "What I told you when you went to join King Harald's men was not wide of the mark, that the way things would turn out for you would not bring good fortune to any of us. Now you have taken the course that I cautioned you against, most of all, by challenging King Harald. For all your prowess and accomplishments, you lack the good fortune to prove a match for King Harald. No one else has managed that in this country, whatever their power and force in numbers. I have an intuition that this will be our last meeting. Considering our ages, you should be destined to live longer, but I feel it will not turn out that way." Then Thorolf boarded his ship and continued on his way. Nothing eventful is said to have happened on his voyage until he arrived home at Sandnes, had all the booty he had taken carried up to his farmhouse and laid up the ships. He had no lack of provisions to keep his men through that winter. Thorolf remained at home all the time and kept no fewer men than the previous winters. There was a powerful and wealthy man named Ingvar, who had been a landholder under the earlier kings. When Harald came to power, Ingvar stayed at home and did not serve him. Ingvar was married and had a daughter named Bera. He lived in Fjordane. Bera was his only child and heir. Grim, Kveldov's son, asked for Bera's hand in marriage, and a match was made. Grim and Bera were married the winter after he and Thorolf parted. He was 25 years old, but already bald, so he was nicknamed Skallagrim, Bald Grim. He was in charge of running the entire farm where he lived with his father and looked after all the provisions, although Kveldov was still fit and healthy. They had many freed slaves with them, and many people in their household who had grown up there and were of a similar age to Scudder. Many of them were men of great strength, because Gweldorf and his sons chose very strong men to join them and match them to their own temperament. Scudder took after his father in terms of physique and strength, and also in complexion and character. King Harold had been in Vik when Thorolf went raiding, then went to Uppland in the autumn, and north from there to Trondheim, where he spent the winter with a large party of men. Sigtrid and Halvard, who were with the king, heard how Thorolf had treated their quarters in Hissing, and about the casualties and damage he had inflicted there. They continually reminded the king of this episode, and also that Thorolf had robbed him and his subjects too, and raided in his country. The brothers asked the king permission to set off to attack Thorolf with the band of men they customarily had with them. You may think there are grounds for taking Thorolf's life, but I feel you badly lack the good fortune to perform that deed, the king answered them. Thorolf is more than a match for you, even though you consider yourselves men of strength and accomplishment. The brothers said that this would soon be put to the test, if the king would grant them leave, adding that they had often taken heavy risks against people they had less reason to take vengeance upon, and had generally come off the better. When spring arrived and everybody prepared to leave, Halvard and his brother broached the subject with the king once again. This time he gave them his permission to kill Thorolf, and I know that you will bring me back his head with many valuables. But some people claim, the king added, that if you sail north you'll need to use your oars and sails as well on the way back. They prepared for the journey immediately, taking 2 ships and 150 men. When they were ready, they sailed out of the fjord into a northeasterly wind, which was against them as they headed northwards along the coast. King Harold stayed at Lade until Halvard and his brother left. Then as soon as they had gone, he prepared to leave as well. He and his men boarded his ships and rowed towards land on the Skarsund Sound, then across Beitjo at the spit at Eldoid. Leaving his ships there, he headed across the spit to Naumdal, where he took a longship owned by the local farmers and put his men on it. He had his own men and almost 300 men with him besides, and 5 or 6 ships, all of them large. They ran into a strong headwind and rowed night and day as hard as they could. It was bright enough to travel by night then. Reaching Sandnes at night after sunset, they saw a great longship floating off the farm with its awnings down, which they recognized as belonging to Thorolf. He had equipped it to sail abroad and was drinking a toast to his journey. The king ordered all his men to leave their ships and had a standard raised. It was a short walk to the farm where Thorolf's guards were sitting inside drinking. There was no guard, no one was outside, and everyone was sitting indoors drinking. The king had his men surround the house. Then they sounded a war cry, and the trumpet sounded the call to battle. When Thorolf and his men heard that, they ran for their weapons that each kept above his bed. One of the king's men called out to the house and ordered the women, children, old people, slaves, and bondsmen to leave. Sigrid, Thorolf's wife, went out with a woman who had been inside and the others who had been allowed to go out. She asked if the sons of Kari from Burl were there, and they stepped forward to ask what she wanted of them. "Take me to the king," she said. They did so, and she went up to the king and asked, "Is it any use to seek a reconciliation between you and Thorolf, my lord?" "If Thorolf is prepared to surrender and put himself at my power and mercy," the king answered, "then his life and limbs will be spared, but his men will be punished as they deserve." Ulverhamp went into the farmhouse and called Thorolf to talk to him, to tell him the option the king had given. Thorolf replied, "I will not accept any settlement that the king tries to force on me. Ask him to allow us to leave, and we will let fate take its own course." Ulver went back to the king and informed him of Thorolf's request. "Set fire to the house," the king ordered. "I do not want to do battle with them and lose my men. I know that Thorolf will inflict heavy casualties upon us if we attack him outside. It will be tough enough to defeat him when he is inside, even though he has fewer men than we do." Then the house was set on fire, and the flames rapidly engulfed it, because the timber was dry and had been tarred, and the beams were covered with bark. Thorolf ordered his men to break down the wall between the main room of the house and the entrance, which was easily done. When they had removed the beam from it, as many of them as could get a grip took hold of it and drove the end against one corner of the room so hard that the joint split on the outside and the walls came apart, giving them an easy way out. Thorolf went out first, followed by Thorgo's boomer, then the rest one by one. Battle ensued then, and for a while the farm shielded Thorolf and his men from behind. But when it started to burn, the fire closed in on them, and many of them were killed. Thorolf ran forward, hewing to both sides towards the king's standard. Then Thorgo's boomer was killed. When Thorolf reached the wall of shields around the king, he thrust his sword through the standard bearer. Thorolf said, "I took 3 steps too few here." He was attacked with both swords and spears, and the king himself delivered the mortal blow, and Thorolf fell at his feet. The king called out, ordering his men not to kill any more, and they stopped fighting. Then he ordered his men down to the ship. He said to Olver and his brother, "Take your kinsman Thorolf and prepare him for a fitting burial, along with the other dead, then bury them. Tend to the wounded who have a chance of living. There will be no plundering here, because all this wealth belongs to me anyway." After that, the king went down to his ships with most of his men, and on board they began tending to their wounds. The king walked around the ship, inspecting the men's wounds, and saw one man bandaging a skin wound he had received. The king said Thorolf had not dealt that wound, for his weapons bit in a completely different way. I do not think many people will be bandaging the wounds he delivered. Such men leave a great loss behind them. In the morning, the king ordered the sails to be hoisted, and they sailed straight south. In the course of the day, the king and his men noticed many rowboats in every sound between the islands. Their crews were on their way to see Thorolf, because he had planted spies all the way to Namdal and in many islands, and they had noticed Halvard and his brother heading north with a large army to attack him. The brothers had met a steady headwind and been forced to stay in various harbors. Word had got around higher up on land and reached Thorolf's spies, which was the reason they were sailing in convoy to join him. The king had favorable winds until he reached Namdal, where he left his ships and crossed to Trondheim overland. There he rejoiced the ships he had left behind, and the party set off for Lade. News of the battle soon spread. Halvard and his brother heard about it when they had moored, and returned to join the king after what was thought to be a rather humiliating expedition. Olver Hump and his brother Ivan Lam remained at Sadness for a while, and admissioned to the battle dead. Thorolf's body was prepared according to the prevailing custom for men of high birth, and they raised a burial stone in his memory. He had the injured nursed back to health and helped Sigrid to put the farm back in order. All the property remained intact. Most of the furniture, tableware, and clothing had burned inside. When Olver and his brother were ready, they set off from the north and went to seeking Harold when he was in Trondheim. They stayed with him, kept a low profile, and spoke little to other people. One day the brothers called on the king, and Olver said, "My brother and I would like to ask your leave to return to our farms, because after these recent events we are not in the mood to sit and drink with the assailants of our kinsman Thorolf." The king looked at him and answered somewhat curtly, "That I will not grant to you. Stay here with me." The brothers left and returned to their seats. The next day the king had Olver and his brother called to him in his chamber. "Now you will know the answer to the matter you raised when you asked my leave to go home," the king said. "You have been here with me for some while and conducted yourselves in a civilized fashion. You have consistently served me well, and I have thought well of you in all ways. Now I want you, Ivan, to go north to Haligaland and marry Sigrid from Sandnes, Thorolf's widow. I will give you all the wealth that belonged to Thorolf, and you will have my friendship too, if you know how to look after such things. Olver will stay with me, I do not want to let him go on account of his skills in poetry." The brothers thanked the king for the honor he had shown them, saying they would readily accept it. Ivan prepared to leave and procured a good, suitable ship. The king gave him tokens to prove his mission. Ivan had a smooth journey and arrived in a lost at Sandnes, where Sigrid gave him and his men a warm welcome. Then Ivan produced the king's tokens and message to Sigrid, and he proposed to her, saying the king had ordered that he should be granted this match. Given what had happened, Sigrid felt she had no choice but to accept the king's will. The marriage was arranged, and Ivan took Sigrid as his wife. He took charge of the farm at Sandnes and all the property that had belonged to Thorolf. Ivan was a man of high birth. His children with Sigrid were Finn the Squinter, who was the father of Ivan the Plagiarist, and Gerlaug, whose husband was Sigvart the Red. Finn the Squinter married Gunhild. Her father was Earl Halfdan, and her mother was Ingebjorg, the daughter of King Harald Fairhair. Ivan's lamb and the king remained friends for the rest of their lives. Thank you for joining Reading Reisende. I hope you enjoyed. Please excuse any background noise. Det är jultid. It is Christmas time, and we are home, and it is chaotic, and all the above, all the things that go along with that. I wish you a beautiful night and good dreams, and may the gods be with you.